Hi, I'm Alan Rose. Welcome to WordFest. Tonight we're going to have three readers, first going over to the United Kingdom, then up to Seattle, and then out to the Pacific Coast and the Long Beach Peninsula. It's really great to see our friend Hannah Dennisonm again. Hannah is coming to us from Devon, England. She used to live in Portland for a while, and during that time, Hannah came up to WordFest at least on two occasions, and you were on Book Chat interviewed. It's really delightful to be with you now. I can't imagine what ungodly hour it is there in England for you, but for here, it's 7 o'clock in the evening. So thank you for staying up.
Oh, it's really nice to do this. And because I moved back to England about 2 years ago, the fact that we're able to do this on Zoom is really exciting for me.
Right.
And it's not too bad, actually. I mean, I'm wearing my pajamas, but you can't see those. Yeah, so this is actually a good time for me. I have my dogs who are asleep. I have
Okay.
my glass of wine. So yeah, it's really nice to be back. Thank you.
Great. Well, Hannah, you have read before at WordFest with your Honeychurch Hall mystery series. And I was delighted that you had started a new mystery series and brought out your first book this last year called Death at High Tide. And this new series is called The Island Sisters Mystery. How did you come to write a new series?
Well, it was something I wasn't planning on doing, but my sister, it's about two sisters basically who inherit a hotel in the Isles of Scilly. And as an aside, I wanted to call it the Scilly Sisters Mysteries, but the publisher said no. Um, but my sister's friend used to be the HR director for a hotel on the Isles of Scilly, which is a tiny little archipelago of islands. And she said that it's very, very small. It's like 2 miles long, 1 mile wide, this little island called Tresco. And she said that people that the sort of the seasonal workers who will come to work on the island were either running away from something or hiding from someone. And I just thought that was a really interesting concept. And as I was with my sister at the time, um, who it's because I was away in America for such a long time, 25 years actually, I'm beginning to get to know her again. And so it seemed a good fit that I would write about two sisters who were reconciled or reunited after years apart, who actually inherit this hotel on a remote island off the southwest peninsula of England. It's about 30 miles from Cornwall. Anyone's a poled up fanatic here. That's where this little cluster of islands are. So it wasn't, it was sort of a plan and not a plan. I wasn't sure if the publisher would go for it because it's more of a locked room. Each mystery will be on a small island. So I have that added challenge of not the Cabot Co, but everyone who would be new to the island would either be murdered or the villain of the piece. So I have to work with that.
I love the Trigaric Island
Trigaric Rock.
Hotel.
Hmm.
Just it reminds me of Wuthering Heights. And this is a very an atmosphere, a very different feel to this novel that I read, High Tide at Death at High Tide, rather than your Honeychurch Hall mystery series. The tone of that, which we'll get into that for that a moment.
Yeah, it's
But
very different.
can you read us a selection from the
Sure,
Death at High Tide?
I'd love to. So also just about the hotel briefly, I stole this hotel from Burr Island, which is close to me in Devon. It's at Bigbury on Sea, and it was the setting for Soldier Island for and then there were none, the PBS series. It's an Art Deco hotel, and it's absolutely fabulous there. So I basically stole that hotel and then I put it on a rock somewhere in the Isles of Scilly, which is great. That's what being a writer is about, I think. So this is a tiny excerpt, just about 3 minutes, and I'm just going to let you know what you need to know about this tiny part. is that my protagonist is Evie, and she's just been widowed. She's about mid-30s, and her husband was much older, and she finds out that he left her absolutely penniless. She has nothing. And then her sister Margot has been a Hollywood producer in Los Angeles, and so she's been living away for 25 years. Weird, hey? Funny that, because write what you know. And so she's come to hear that it's the reading of the will. So the two sisters are together. Evie's really, really shocked that it sounds like she's going to have absolutely nothing. So they're sitting in the solicitor's office, and she finds out that she's just been given a letter from the solicitor's assistant. And Margot says, "What have you got there?" Margot demanded. "Sherry just gave this to me," I said. "It's from my husband." "Let me see that," Nigel said sharply. I showed him the envelope. His eyes widened in surprise. He immediately hit the intercom button. "Sherry, that envelope, where did you find it?" "Oh, in my to-file box under my desk," we all heard her say. "It must have been sent over with Robert's documents." I was looking for something else, and there it was. I don't know how it ended up. "Well, never mind," Nigel said curtly, and shut off the intercom, silencing whatever Sherry was about to say next. "I'd like to read this in private, if you don't mind," I said. "Margot, you can stay." "Oh," Nigel seemed taken aback. "Of course." He got up and left the room. "Go on, open it," Margot said. "It's probably some bizarre burial request or something." "I am going to open it," I said, "but from now on, please let me handle Nigel. You've been so rude. He's such a good friend." "Well, someone has to ask the difficult questions." She regarded me with incredulity. "I still find it hard to believe you didn't notice that Robert was running out of money. I know I would have. My husband and I share everything." "Well, Robert handled the money," I said, "and I was happy for him to do so. He was always very generous to me." "Generous?" Margot exclaimed. "I should hope so. It's not the 1950s. She took my hand again. What happened to my independent little sister who wouldn't allow a man to even open her car door? I got old. "You're 36, Margot exclaimed. "Granted, that's old for California, but here—" "All right, I grew up." "Bullshits." I smiled at our childish made-up swear word. "You were always the rebel," Margot went on. "You were always the one getting into trouble at school. You even lost your virginity before me. And then the minute you met Robert, you changed. You became the demure little stay-at-home wife. I mean, what about your photography? You just let it all go." I didn't answer. Margot had struck a nerve. It was true. I had put my photography dreams on hold while we focused on having a family. A family. I felt sick as I remembered Michael's damning comments the night before his father died. "Well, if you're not going to open it, I will." Margot snatched the envelope out of my grasp and picked up the silver letter opener on Nigel's desk. "Go ahead," I said. "I don't think I can handle any more emotion right now. You read it." So Margot did, her eyes swiftly darting across the paper. She went very quiet, then broke into a huge grin. "Well, this is excellent news." "No jokes, please," I said. "I'm not joking. If you are reading this letter," she read, "it means you are the proud owner of Tregarrick Rock." "A painting? Who's the artist?" I asked. "Not a painting. You'll never believe what it is." She handed me the letter. "It's actually a hotel." So that's a little clip there.
I think I mentioned to you that if I ever got into trouble, I would want Margot on my side.
I know, she's so feisty.
She's very feisty. That's right. So Margot and Evie take off to this hotel on Tregarrick Rock, which is a very sinister type of setting for being Art Deco. And they meet quite an interesting group of people. And I very much love the constable, the female constable.
Oh, Patty. I love Patty.
Yes,
She,
yes,
it's really
she's quite good. I remember the part where she's reciting the Miranda rights, and then she says, "Oh, and the rest of them." She can't remember all of them. So that was fun, and it was wonderful to see a new series emerge. How do you manage to write simultaneously two different series, because you have a new Honeychurch Hall mystery coming out in, you had one in October, um, and you have another one coming out in March. So
Yeah.
you just have all these books coming. How do you keep them straight, and how do you maintain two mystery series at the same time?
This actually didn't quite work out how I was dreaming it would. You know, at the beginning of the year, I planned out how my writing would look like. But because I'm writing for two different publishers, I don't get a say in the deadlines. And so my deadlines were almost a month apart.
Wow.
So I'm feeling anxious even thinking about it. But I did find that I can write with two different parts of my brain. And I'm sure that when you were doing your editing with your amazing book, A Sif Death Summons, which I absolutely love, have to mention it. Um, I was fine with creating, or the blank page was more of a like throwing the ideas out on paper. But when it came to crafting each paragraph, which was a totally different type of discipline, I was able to do those two things. But if I had to do both starting at the same time or crafting at the same time, I know I couldn't have done that. Because even then, even knowing I had these two different ways of writing, I found that I was doing some overlaps without even noticing that there were parallels with some of the characters. One liked to run marathons and was into extreme sports, and then I find the other one's a rock climber that likes extreme sports. And I'm thinking, oh my God, why did I do that? So I think subconsciously it is quite hard to keep them separate, which is another reason why I don't read many mysteries when I'm writing, because subconsciously sometimes it's like osmosis. You don't actually know that you're taking in those ideas. Plus, yeah, also the tone is very different. Death at High Tide is a little bit more of a traditional mystery. It's a bit more not serious. I mean, there's no serial killer or anything in it. Whereas Honeychurch is much more like Midsummer Murders, Doc Martin humor. There's humor in it, and frankly, it's not. I wouldn't say it's bordering on fast, but some of the situations are on the spectrum of being extreme, I think, which I have fun doing that.
Right. So part of it is writing the different series at different stages of the process helps.
Yes.
I also noticed that Death at High Tide, there was humor in it, and particularly around Margot, who I quite enjoyed, particularly that there's also, it was sort of darker than
Mm.
Honeychurch Hall. And Honeychurch Hall, I've been delighted in because it was light and funny, and yet there was also the serious required death that was part of it too.
Yeah, you have to get those in.
Yes, right.
Have to get the
I
murders
guess
in.
that's a question I would have for you. Do you find murder therapeutic?
Um, I this is terrible to say this. I did a few years ago, and I was going through a tricky part of my life. I found it very therapeutic getting rid of certain people. Now I ask friends and say, is there anyone you'd like me to dispose of? Because I'm very happy to. And so I have no end of people who are volunteering their ex-boyfriends and ex-husbands, or the boiler man who didn't show up and things. So
Yes.
and because I write cozy mysteries with the Honeychurch Hall series, there is no gore on the page. There's no bludgeoning to death or anything. It's just alluded to after the fact. So I feel like it's not a real dark, serial killer stuff.
Right. Do you want to tell us a bit about the book you just brought out in October?
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah, tidings of where is my tidings of death, which is kind of strange actually. I think I was mentioning to you earlier about how similar the titles were, which was crazy because this is tidings of death and this is death at high tide, but different publishers. So and obviously different types of covers, but yeah, this is I really enjoyed writing this one for some reason because it was Christmas, it was a Christmas book. So, things come out early there. And I touched basically Honeychurch Hall is a contemporary upstairs, downstairs, or Downton Abbey. So you've still got the old family living in the hall that's falling down. And then you have the old staff members, there might only be a handful now. And then my protagonist, Kat, who's an antique dealer, she used to be on a TV show, and her mother, Iris, who is a secret romance writer, but she doesn't write just romance. She writes like the really racy 50 Shades of Grey stuff, and nobody knows about it. Not even Kat. She didn't know that. So it's very different in tone. And this book I like because there was where I used to live in when I was growing up, there was this hawk called the Bleeding Hawk of Hillersdon, and it was a stuffed, mummified hawk that came back from the Crimea. And every time there was a war, it would bleed, but nobody knew, and then there'd be a curse. And I've been dying to put this in a book for as long as I knew about it. So it does appear, it's on the cover here actually, it does appear in this book as the Bleeding Hawk of Honeychurch Hall, needless to say, which is where this story begins. And it begins at the hall, who have opened their museum room for the locals to come in at Christmas and have little drinks and, you know, admire all the artifacts. So unfortunately, within about 5 seconds of the whole thing opening up, the butler, who's like 100 years old, has who was supposed to be watching and making sure that no one was stealing the silver. He actually is crushed under a coat of armor. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's like, you know, but he's under the jousting suit of the third Earl or something.
Okay.
But meanwhile, Lord Rupert Honeychurch, he is convinced that there's been a robbery, because he never wanted to open the house to the general hoi polloi, you know, so you still have the class system there. So shall I read a little bit, just a little tiny excerpt? It's very quick. So, "We've been robbed," Lord Honeychurch exclaimed. My heart sank. I knew this would happen. I should never have listened to you, Kat. This is your fault. What exactly has been taken? I finally managed to say. Well, probably not the polar bear, Mum said, and laughed. I haven't had a thorough look yet, Rupert went on, but the pocket watches that my ancestor brought back from the Crimea have definitely gone. Are you sure? I'd taken photographs of each display cabinet and listed their contents the day before. Couldn't remember seeing any pocket watches from the Crimea. Delia, the housekeeper, took a deep breath. Without meaning to speak ill of the dead, "The butler's not dead yet, Mrs. Evans," Rupert said coldly. "Oh, I know, my lord, I know. I'm just saying that he wasn't exactly on the ball, and he was supposed to be on guard, looking out for the silver." "And that's where I completely disagree with you," his lordship declared. "Cropper was very much on the ball. He was able to give us a vital clue shortly before he was taken away in the ambulance." I was surprised. "Well, what did he tell you?" "The police have been informed, and that's all I'm prepared to say for the time being." "I think that couple from up north had something to do with it," Mum suggested. "They couldn't get out of here quick enough." "And she didn't want to take off her coat," Delia added. "She could have stuffed the watches in her pocket," Mum agreed. "And what with that dog biting her husband and then the butler falling, it was the perfect diversion." "You mean you allowed people to come into the museum who weren't local?" Rupert sounded horrified. This was an argument I knew I couldn't win. I wanted to say that I could hardly ask for people's postcodes, and besides, Rupert had hoped for a big turnout. He couldn't have it both ways. "No," Delia declared. "I've changed my mind. That woman from the north wouldn't have done it. She's pregnant." "As if being pregnant makes you a saint," Mum said. "I know I wasn't." "Mind you, someone has stolen my crystal necklace and matching earrings. They belong to my grandmother." "Well, it can't be the Northerners," said Mum. "They only got here an hour ago. You just forgot where you put them." "Sorry, I only just managed to get away, my lord," came a familiar voice, and Santa Claus entered the room, or rather, Detective Inspector Sean Cropper, dressed in a red Santa suit and wearing a fake white beard with thick bushy eyebrows. "I was manning the grotto at the holiday bazaar at the school," he added. "Oh, good heavens," my mother exclaimed. "Last time we saw you, you were dressed as Paddington at the Bear Fest." In fact, it was one of the last times I'd seen the handsome police officer too. Ever since he and Lady Lavinia's eccentric brother had fought like schoolboys for my attention, Sean had been avoiding me. Now he shot me a shy smile. So very, very different in tone
Very, yes,
and
yes.
situation. So yeah.
Well, Hannah, it's always great to talk with you. And I should remind you that you've been gone for 2 years, but we do have a new administration coming in, so it's safe to come back.
I know, I'm very excited. And before I left, I got my citizenship. So I am an American citizen. So
Right.
I voted.
I know I'm going to get trouble, emails coming in about making that comment about the new administration. But anyway, I don't care. It's wonderful to have you on WordFest again. I look forward to the time when we can get back together.
Yeah, me too. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's really always lovely to see you. Okay.
Take care.
All right. Bye.
It is a pleasure to meet a new writer to WordFest, actually a good friend of Hannah Dennison's. And how I met Marty Wingate was through Hannah. Hannah, you were in Seattle. Thank you for joining us. One of the benefits of taking WordFest on Zoom is we get to meet authors outside of the Lower Columbia area. So welcome to WordFest.
Thanks so much, Alan. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, you, like Hannah, are a writer of what are called cozy mysteries or mysteries with amateur sleuths. I'm interested that this new book that you just brought out, Glamour Girls, is a departure from writing mysteries, going into historical fiction. Can you tell us about the book?
Certainly. It is a departure. The thing that Glamour Girls has in is the same as my other series, is that it is set in England. So all of my books are set in England. I feel a real affinity to the country. My husband and I travel over there a lot when we can. And some of the mysteries I've written have had historical threads in them. And so I found myself drawn to a story. It's set in World War II in England. And and it's a standalone, so it's not a series, and that's very different. But I found myself drawn to it. My agent brought this to my attention first, actually, that in 2018, one of the last female pilots in England died, who flew during the war. She was a ferry pilot. And she was 101, Mary Wilkins Ellis. And just last week, the last female pilot died. So that was very interesting. So I was drawn to this story about a woman pilot among about 160 something pilots who worked for the ATA, the Air Transport Auxiliary, and flew airplanes around England and Scotland and Wales. Because, of course, at the beginning of the war, no one thought women could fly planes. Well, I mean, they were flying, but this was an unsuitable job for a woman. And so it's always fun to find those stories where someone says, "Oh yeah," and goes ahead and does it. And so this is Rosalie Wright's story from beginning just as the war starts to the end of the war.
I see. Now, Rosalie, you say was a Spitfire pilot.
Yes, well, this Rosalie's story is inspired by Mary Ellis's story, and she flew. Now the number has escaped me, but I mean, she flew a lot of different airplanes, and so Rosalie flies a lot. The Spitfire is the iconic plane for in England for World War II, and there were a lot of them. And so she flew a lot of Spitfires. She flew Hurricanes and Mosquitoes and Ants and Avrils and all sorts of planes. But we like this. It's a Spitfire on the cover, and so we like to. It's something that everyone knows about.
Right, right. Did she engage in combat, or was she basically trying to get planes to different parts of England?
Exactly. Well, the ATA pilots were non-operational planes. They had no ammunition. They had no radar. They had no radio. They flew, yes, they flew during the day only, and they delivered planes from the manufacturers to RAF bases or between RAF bases or to a maintenance unit. It started out, the Air Transport Auxiliary started out right after the war started in September of 39. It was designed to move mail around and medical supplies, but they very quickly realized that they needed a lot of help because they were manufacturing so many airplanes. So that's when they started moving into ferrying planes. So there was no actual, she almost got in the middle of an airfield battle at one point in the book, but she obviously had nothing to do with that. So her adventures were, she didn't shoot anyone. Let's put it that way.
Would you read a selection from the book?
I will, certainly. This is at the very beginning of the book, and Rosalie grew up on a farm near Cambridge, and she had two older brothers. She was younger by a few years, and the favorite of her dad's, of course, his only daughter. And she fell in love with flying early in the 30s when her dad took her to Sir Alan Cobham's flying circus. It was like this, air show that went around the country, and he paid a few shillings and she got to go up in a plane, and that was it for her. She loved flying and took flying lessons and was working toward getting her license when the air broke out, and there was no pleasure flying allowed after that at all. And so she thought that was the end of it. But then the ATA was formed, and Pauline Gower got women involved in the ATA. Of course, nobody was going to let the women fly in the war to begin with, but that got started. And so Rosalie managed to get in training and ended up stationed at Hamble, number 15 Ferry Pool, Hamble, which is near Southampton in Hampshire, right on the coast there. So this is just at the end of her first day. She's been billeted with Mrs. May. People who were in the area of any services or anything had to take people in, and they got paid for it, and they got the person's ration book so they could buy food for them. And Rosalie is just coming back from her first day of flying. She tarried at Hamble, catching a cup of tea on her own in the mess. She arrived back at her billet at 7 o'clock to find Mrs. May in the kitchen where she'd left her, but this time with the aroma of something savory emanating from the oven. "Good evening, Mrs. May. You'll be relieved to know I take a broad view of the time of the evening meal," the landlady said as a greeting. "Better to cook something that will keep than to cook a meal that will go over as it sits there waiting to be eaten." She turned to Rosalie, who stood in the doorway. "Where's the other one?" "Caro had a full day. She said she could be late," Rosalie said. "Should we wait for her?" "And how long would that be?" Mrs. May replied. "I had a fellow here before you girls. He took an airplane to Scotland, and I didn't see him for 3 days." "You had men billeted here before us?" Rosalie asked. "You'll wash your hands, won't you?" Rosalie, about to slide down onto a chair, popped back up without a word, having heard much the same question all her life. She took the stairs to the first floor, washed, and made it back just as Mrs. May was using a tea towel to pull a pie out of the oven. It landed on the table with a thunk, and she attacked it with a knife, scooped out a steaming mass onto a plate, and handed it over. Oh, Rosalie said, stabbing at a large white cube with her fork. Swedes. I had only the one pilot, bear of a man. Thank God I had no one else. He took up that much room. But he had no interest in filling the hole in the garden for me. Mrs. May nodded toward the back, and Rosalie realized that she was now on the hook for sorting out a new veg patch for the landlady. I'll have 13 days on, and then I'll have a couple off, she explained. I'll get stuck in after that. Lord Woolton's pie, the landlady stated. We're to use what we have, and Mrs. Potts over the road has more Swedes than she knows what to do with. Rosalie felt as if their conversation was out of sync. Was that what any prolonged discussion with Mrs. May was like? Ask a question and get it answered 2 turns later? The carrots are sweet, Rosalie commented. He had only one eye, the landlady replied. Didn't know they let you fly an airplane with only one eye. Ancient and tattered airmen, Rosalie said. That's what they were called in the newspapers. The ATA has men who are too old for the RAF and others who have physical problems. I hear one of them is missing an arm. Ancient and tattered, the landlady repeated. And so, what do they call you women? Rosalie's face reddened with both embarrassment and pride. They call us Atta girls.
I would expect that it's in the time of war, but Rosalie's conflicts are going to be other than against Germans.
Yes, she has a few battles to fight on various fronts. One of the fronts, and this is a story that Mary Ellis told about her flying life during the war. She landed at an airfield, one of the hundreds of times more than hundreds of times she landed at an airfield, got out of the plane. The ground crew came up to the plane and the men said, "Where's the pilot?" And he said, "I am the pilot." So that was, there was that attitude that there were some men that had trouble with women pilots. And also the mix of women at the, Hamble was an all-female ferry pool, and there were 2 or 3 of them around, and there were some mixed, and then there were some that were almost all men. But you get women from different walks of life bumping up against each other. And so there are some problems there. And Rosalie has always been a very quiet, solitary person. And so she's shoved in the middle of this and ends up becoming good friends with Caro, the other woman that's billeted at Mrs. May's. And it's as if she has a sister for the first time in her life.
That's great. Did Mrs. Ellis ever, was she aware of you writing this book about her life?
No, sadly, she wasn't. Mary Ellis wrote her own memoir of her experiences in the war, and I have that book. It's very interesting to read because she ended up, I mean, she was a very accomplished woman. After the war, she got married. She and her husband ran an airfield, a private airfield on the Isle of Wight. So she worked in aviation her whole life. I admire that greatly. But when she wrote her memoir, every time she mentioned a specific plane she flew on a specific day, she would put the serial number in the text of the book. So she was very exacting. But she died before this idea came up, actually. And it was, as I said, it was my agent that brought the idea up to me, and we discussed it. And it's just really, it's interesting and fun to see how her story, I took her story, but I also read other memoirs, women's memoirs of the war. And so there was a wealth of stories out there that they told, the things that happened. And I had a great time using that and weaving it in. And it's very interesting that I had, for this first historical fiction that I wrote, I had a very specific time. I knew what the timeline was. It was the beginning of the war. It was August, September 1939 to the end of the war in 1945. And so I had a framework to work under.
Right, right. I'm interested to go into historical fiction from the mystery genre. What was that like for you? How were they different, if they were different?
Well, there's a lot of research, of course, but that's fun. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of my mysteries have some sort of historical thread. So, in my first series, the Potting Shed Mysteries, it's about an American gardener who moves to England and tries to get a job. In almost every one of those books, it starts out, the main character is working in London and digs up a Roman mosaic in someone's back garden. So, as her friend says, oh, Roman ruins are common as dirt in London, which they are practically. So then there's this theme of Rome. I even had a World War II theme a little bit in one of the books. So I've always enjoyed that. But I did want to be very careful. Obviously, I wanted to be very careful about the things I could not change, the specific events that happened in the war, what rationing was like when things got rationed. Um, the, the the thing that I discovered, as all historical fiction writers have discovered before me, is that you can know a lot, but you don't need to put it all in the book. This is that you're not trying to teach someone what it was like to live during World War II. You want to create an atmosphere.
Right.
So that's a tricky business.
Yeah, I would expect that the mystery genre has certain guidelines that you sort of follow along, but with the historical fiction, you're probably wide open out there. Other than the time frame, you're sort of making it up as you go, I expect.
Yes, exactly. You're making up your character stories as you go, and you can uh, uh, to as far as the facts of the historical period in which your book is set, you can, I suppose, use or not use them as suits your character stories. I mean, there are some things you can't change at all, and I didn't try to change Churchill's speeches or anything like that, or the king. I did, however, read Radio Times, which is a long-running magazine in England and started in the 30s, might have started in the 20s when wireless came out. I did read the schedule of, of Radio Times for specific days, Christmas Day, things like that, in the years I was writing, because as if I thought somebody was going to say, wait a minute, that program wasn't on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know why I thought that, but I really wanted those things to be specific. But then, you can kind of mush around with other things.
Great, great. Could you read a bit more of the book for us?
I'd be happy to. This is a piece with Rosalie in the airplane, not in a Spitfire this time, but I am not a pilot myself, so I don't have the experience that Rosalie had. However, at Maidenhead in England, it's just outside of London, is the Air Transport Auxiliary Museum, and they have a Spitfire simulator there. And both my husband and I took a half-hour turn. We had someone next to us in the simulator. It was great. It was really fun. Believe me, nobody ever wants to go up in an airplane with me being the pilot. I'll tell you that right now. But it gave you a sense, and because the ATA pilots didn't fly very high. Most of the time they were flying between 500 and 1,000 feet. So that's really low. If you think, I looked at the Columbia Tower or whatever it's called now in Seattle to figure, how low is an airplane flying when they're that high. So that was great. So this does have to do with Rosalie flying, and it does reflect back a little bit on her farm days. And when she grew up on the farm, she did have responsibilities. She was in charge of the sheep and she was in charge of the geese and the chickens, but she didn't like the cows. She never liked cows. They kind of scared her. So here we are, Rosalie flying along. This is July 1942. Rosalie skirted the barrage balloons that ringed Southampton and turned west, flying low over the New Forest. It was a day to glory in. The sky was so blue it almost hurt her eyes. She had forgotten to pull on her leather helmet, and the wind whipped through her curls, but it didn't matter. She brought the control stick toward her to climb a bit higher and aimed her tiger moth toward its destination, Aston Down. After 9 months at Hamble, Rosalie no longer felt slighted when she received a chitty saying she was to deliver one of the open-air trainer biplanes. In fact, she rather looked at it as if she'd run into an old friend again. After all, soon enough, she would have her Class 4 plus certificate. She'd written Alan to tell him that when that happened, she'd be flying mosquitoes, and he reminded her about not undershooting her landing. He didn't mention his own flying, only that he hoped to see her soon. She spotted her runway at Aston Down and circled once to see her way clear. Then she squared up, eased back on the throttle, and pushed the stick away from her, dropping the nose of the airplane until she could level out, touch down, taxi to the end of the field, and turn round to make her way back to stop near the duty officer's hut. When she was about 100 feet off the ground, an aeroplane, large and lumbering, appeared from nowhere, coming over a copse directly at her. Rosalie had no time to think. In a split second, she had pulled back hard on the control stick, sending her nose up sharply and her plane just barely over the top of the other aircraft. Her moth bounced as the updraft from the other plane hit her underside and sent her wobbling. A quick look back told her she'd almost collided with an Avro Anson. If she had, she knew who would have come out the worse for it. Safe, she broke out in a sweat and then shivered. Clearing the copse of oaks the Anson had appeared from, she pulled left, thinking only to put down as soon as she could before the shock got the better of her. There she saw a clear field on the other side of the hedge from the airfield. But the field was short, and by the time she stopped completely, the nose of the moth was in the hedge, and the starboard wing had scraped along a patch of brambles. She heard something snap, and the stern warning in the ATA pilot's book, "The country does not pay you to break airplanes," rang in her ears. Then anger stirred. "Who the bloody hell was that?" she shouted, her voice thick. "Could he not see me coming in?" Her entire body shook, and she forced herself to breathe slowly in and out before she could regain composure and venture out of the plane. She knew landing mix-ups were not all that unusual, but the ATA flew in daylight, and pilots were supposed to be able to stay out of one another's way. At least, she told herself, she was more agile in her moth than the pilot of that Anson. There now, that's better, she thought, as her heart rate steadied. She wiped the sweat off her face and huffed. Time to report to the duty officer. Someone else would need to figure out how to get the moth out of the brambles. But leaving the plane would not be that easy, because when she climbed out onto the wing, it was to meet a crowd looking up at her in anticipation, as if she were about to give a speech. A crowd of cows, that is, 10 or 12 of them. She could hear the puffs of breath coming from cavernous nostrils, and their wide heads were just about level with her feet. One of them came close enough for its huge tongue to snake out and lick the airplane's wing as if conducting a taste test. Rosalie stumbled back, catching herself before she could fall into the cockpit.
Great. Thank you. Marty, it's been delightful to have you on WordFest. And at the end of the program, we will be having a question and answer period. So I hope that you'll be able to join us for that.
Oh, yes, I will. Thanks, Alan.
Great, great. I was also thinking as you were reading, Eric Larson brought out a wonderful book this last year, The Vile and the Splendid, about the home front of England during the war, which was a fascinating book, which seemed like that would really dovetail beautifully with your story here too. Yeah,
Yes, yes, and I love Eric Larson's books.
yeah, me too. Great. Well, thank you. We'll get back to you later with the question and answer time.
All
Thank
right,
you.
so much.
Well, next we're going to go to the Long Beach Peninsula and to meet with Jan Bono. Jan is no stranger to WordFest. She's read for us several times, but generally she's always read from her cozy mysteries. And tonight, Jan will be sharing some of her poetry, specifically poetry for the upcoming gathering of Fisher poets in Astoria. So Jan, good evening.
Hi, Alan. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you again. First off, we have this event, which I hope some of our people have gone out to the coast to participate in before. And if not, hopefully they'll participate this year since it's going to be on Zoom, like much else. Can you tell us about this gathering of Fisher poets?
Sure thing. Mountain men always got together to have their annual rendezvous in the Rocky Mountains. And, that was what they did at the end of their season of gathering the beaver and the fur traps and those kind of things. And so the cowboys had a roundup, and that's when they drove the cattle all and they were getting on the train cars to go to the slaughterhouses. Well, in Astoria, Oregon, we have the gathering of Fisher poets. And Fisher poetry is a really specific genre. They like to keep it to just commercial fishermen, but some of us who are more of a sport fisherman person kind of wiggle in there too. It began in 1998, and that's this would be the 23rd year. And the first 22 years, it's been growing bigger and bigger and bigger, now up to 7 or 8 venues, different bars or restaurants or just event places. The Liberty Theater is involved in Astoria, and you can buy the $20 button and go from place to place to place following your favorite poets because they put out a big program, or you can stay put and have the poets kind of rotate to you. So you can have a burger in one place, a beer in another, get some fries, hang out with different friends, and just, get involved in any way you wish. And usually on Saturday afternoons, there's a lot of different events you can go to, like how to tie different knots on a boat, and how to hook it to the dock kind of thing. And this year it's going to be different, a lot different. 2021 is going to be as unnormal a word. It's different. It's very strange. It's going to be on 3 nights instead of 2. It'll be February 25th, 26th, and 27th. And it's a Zoom event, but they're going to be figuring out how to do that on both YouTube and Facebook as a live stream. And of course, you won't be buying the $20 button to go from place to place, but when you go to the website, there is a donation button, and they'd sure like you to help us keep this thing afloat. No pun intended. So the website is fisherpoets.org for more information. All lowercase, just like it sounds, fisherpoets.org. Thanks.
Okay, great. And you have a book which has your poetry for the event called Fisher Girl, Fisher Wife, Fisher Poet. Can you tell us about the book?
My grandfather on my dad's side was a Mississippi River fisherman. He went out in his boat every day. He caught whatever he could catch. He could catch catfish or pike, or sometimes a little sturgeon would come up the Mississippi. And he brought them to the docks and sold them. And my father and his 7 brothers and sisters helped out when they could with that. Mostly they were sharecroppers. And so when my dad moved up to Washington, as did 5 of his other brothers and sisters, he became a sport fisherman in almost the most avid sense. And I was the firstborn. So I became Dad's little fisher person to go with him. And I loved that so much that, my first steelhead, my first salmon, my first trout, my first crappie, everything was on, recorded and take pictures of. And I was just really small when that happened. And yet I grew into a really love of that. And then I married a commercial fisherman. Who knew? That lasted a little less than a decade. And for a while there, I was a dock rat. And I was always down with the guys meeting the boats coming in and, taking the groceries down to the boat and those kind of things. But the three parts of the book, Fisher Girl, Fisher Wife, Fisher Poet, it made a natural division into my progression with that. And if you'd like, I have a little thing I could read about that.
Please.
This poem talks about my grandfather, who was the first fisherman of our family. And it's called "It Must Run in the Family." I never met my grandfather on my father's side. My dad was only 16 when his old man died. But I've heard many tales of the risks he took on the Mississippi River while out setting a hook. My father's father was a fisherman by trade, working hard to earn every single dollar that he made. Gramps spent nearly all his life out there on the river, glad the fish buyers lined up to meet his boat when he delivered. He caught German carp and drums and pike, but the tasty yellow catfish was what they'd really like. Yellow catfish paid a needed 5 cents a pound more and helped him keep the wolf away from their door. The boys helped out in summer when the hot sun shined. They set hoop nets from the boat and managed the jump lines. Each line had 50 hooks and they were 10 feet apart. Pulling them in took muscles and a great amount of heart. One day, the boys were fishing just standing on the shore when a catfish took their line, pulled hard, and wanted more. They wrestled that fish in, though he put up quite a fight. It was the biggest catfish ever. Oh, it was quite a sight. They stuck a heavy tree branch right through the monster's gills, hoisted it up on their shoulders to carry it up the hill. They used a cotton scale to weigh it, so no exaggerating, guessing the weights as they were balanced. They were just anticipating. 39 pounds of catfish, the scale proclaimed. That catfish is huge, the neighbors exclaimed. They got their picture taken, though cameras were rare. Uncle Doc on the left, my dad Frank on the right. The credit they did share. Not one of those 8 kids followed the old man to the sea, but my father loved to sport fish, and he passed that on to me. And when I eat fried catfish with Creole mayonnaise, I'm grateful for my heritage and my father's good old days.
Great. Very good. Very
You
nice.
might notice that fishing poetry almost always rhymes. There are people like Fisher poet Dave Densmore who says they have to rhyme. And there are others like Fisher poet Gino Leach who say, as long as you've got the rhythm and the rocking and the meter, just he can tell you any kind of a story and it sounds like it's a poem. It's just beautiful stuff. And I really encourage everybody to come out and listen to it.
How about another?
I would like to go back to my roots then. That would be fun. And this poem is called In the Beginning, the very first time my dad took me fishing with him. You can't go fishing, my mother said, without taking your daughter along. Dad rolled his eyes and tried again, but I won't be gone that long. But Mom insisted and packed my bag, and Dad at last relented. And even then I knew I loved that lifestyle he presented. Out on the lake in a tiny pram, Dad fly fished for his trout. And I watched in awe as he cast and reeled, my hero, without a doubt. Hard to believe how young I was when Dad took me fishing with him, for I was only 2 back then, and I hadn't learned to swim. But Mom was pregnant with kid number 2, and she really needed a break. So Dad begrudgingly took me along when he went out on the lake. He tied a harness around my waist, tied the other end to the boat. As if I fell into the water, he wasn't sure that I would float.
Very nice. Well, Jan, we'll look forward to the gathering of the Fisher Poets and your further readings. And thank you for introducing us to this event coming up. And I hope you'll be sticking around for the question and answer following this.
Absolutely. I will be here.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ellen.
And that's it for WordFest tonight. On behalf of our director, Vicki J. Carter, and Bethany Glenn, our editor, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next month.